Welcome back to another episode, Doll. Throughout this episode, we're going to watch a video called The Controversial Future of Genetic Testing, and we're going to debunk some claims of a few who wish to do eugenics again. If you just allow me to share my screen.
Let's see how this works.
I don't know how it works. Does it have any instructions?
Jamie and Brennan Cassidy were first pregnant 2 years ago. Then they found out the fetus had a severe genetic disorder.
During the first pregnancy, we found out that the child, if born, would not live for very long, and we chose to terminate.
What was that like?
Pretty horrible. It was really hard, for a pregnancy that you wanted, and for us, we didn't know what would come next.
This time, the Cassidys got pregnant using IVF, so they could use a genetic test to screen out for the disorder. Soon, they found out they could also screen for all kinds of common diseases.
I have type 1 diabetes, and I would do anything to not pass that burden along. There's most likely a misconception out there that when people hear genetic testing, I'm sure they're thinking immediately trying to make your child the next LeBron James or the next Elon Musk. And that's not what this is at all.
I think every parent, just wants to bring a healthy child into the world.
But what is healthy, though? That's the question we've got to bring up. Because ever since the eugenics movement, health has been based on statistical fiction. It's just been based on averages rather than actual health. So altogether, really, health is more to do with relationships. It's not about fitting some statistical model. If you just give me a moment to turn to a book called Eugenics and Other Evils. This was one thing which debunked the eugenics movement and discredited their beliefs of the eugenicists. Right. I quote, Mr. Wells' point was this, that we cannot be certain about the inheritance of health, because health is not a quality. It is not a thing like darkness in the hair or length in the limbs. It's a relation, a balance. You have a tall, strong man, but his very strength depends on his not being too tall for his strength. You catch a healthy, full-blooded fella, but his very health depends on his not being too full of blood. A heart that is strong for a dwarf will be weak for a giant. A nervous system that would kill a man with a trace of a certain illness will sustain him to 90 if he has no trace of that illness. Nay, the same nervous system might kill him if he had an excess of some other comparatively healthy thing. Seeing, therefore, that there are apparently healthy people of all types, it is obvious that if you make two of them, you may even then produce a discord out of two inconsistent harmonies. It is obvious that you can no more be certain of a good offspring than you can be certain of a good tune if you play two fine airs at once on the same piano. You can be even less certain of it in the more delicate case of beauty, of which the eugenicists talk a great deal. Marry two handsome people whose noses tend to be aquiline, and their baby, for all you know, may be a goblin with a nose like an enormous parrot's. Indeed, I actually know a case of this kind. The eugenicist has to settle not the result of fixing one steady fin to a second steady fin, but what will happen when one toppling and dizzy equilibrium crashes into another. This is the interesting conclusion. It is on this degree of knowledge that we are asked to abandon the universal morality of mankind, when we have stopped the lover from marrying the unfortunate woman he loves, when we have found him another uproariously healthy female whom he does not love in the least. Even then, we have no logical evidence that the result may not be as horrid and dangerous as if he had behaved like a man of honor. End of quote. So yeah, health is actually more to do with relationships between things like a lot of so-called symptoms to autism tend to have a relationship with gut bacteria, But we only find that these issues occur when the good and bad bacteria in the gut fall out of balance. So when you've got an imbalance of good and bad bacteria, when one overgrows the other, that's when we start to see health issues. But when you restore that balance, put things back in balance, the issues tend to go away. They tend to stop getting sensory overload. They start being able to talk once they've rebalanced that relationship in the gut, as that will send inflammation towards the brain, and it can fail to clot out and disturb all the pruning and brain development. So this imbalance between gut bacteria causes a lot of problems. So you can see that health is more to do with relationships and not statistical fiction. If we carry on.
That's what, we were looking to do.
It's routine for doctors to test fetuses and embryos for cystic fibrosis, as well as other diseases caused by a mutation in a single gene. But the Cassidys used a new type of polygenic test that screens for conditions caused by multiple genes. It's called PGTP, and it works by collecting biopsies from embryos and then testing them for their risk of developing diseases.
Look, an idiot with £1 million could make hundreds of thousands in profit in just a few days.
These are the results that they give you, and it just says the likelihood of type 1 diabetes, type 2, and then it goes down the list.
Testicular cancer, prostate cancer, a couple types of melanoma, hypertension, and schizophrenia, among other things. That's a lot of potential diseases. Did you end up choosing the embryo with the lowest risk for type 1 diabetes?
We did, yeah.
This already sets a red flag when Colin talking about schizophrenia based on genes. Actually, no, if you just allow me to turn towards another book, for example, by PhD Thomas Armstrong, called The Power of Neurodiversity, Unleashing the Advantages of Your Differently Wired Brain. If I just found the right page, here it is. I quote, "The genes that have been examined in the course of this book have been associated with specific disabilities. Yet, this is just to say that they have been found, on average, more often in those with a particular diagnosis. The policy here is to identify the ADHD gene or schizophrenic genes, when we really don't even know what the mechanisms of these genes are in creating proteins that relate to specific psychiatric conditions. And the fact that so-called normal people have these genes too makes the task of identifying abnormal genes that much more difficult." End of quote. So if these genes are in so-called normal people as well, wouldn't that mean that we're going to do a lot of aborting on others as well? Those who wouldn't even have the disease to begin with, or disorder, or health issue. So you can't take for granted that the trigger, what seems a genetic disease, is actually within the gene itself. And the gene always may not be activated as it is interconnected with the environment. Without environmental signals, the genes wouldn't function at all. So there's a red flag already on gene testing, is they're looking for genes that don't even exist. The schizophrenic gene, the ADHD gene, the autism gene, when there's no such thing whatsoever.
TP is controversial because no one knows how accurate its predictions will be. So far, fewer than 100 babies have been born to families who used it.
Fewer than 100 babies born to the families who used it. And didn't I just predict that because those genes were being so-called normal people as well, you're going to get a big list of potential diseases, disorders that you are susceptible to, or what your fetus will be susceptible to, that you're going to, oh no, we don't want this one, we don't want this one, we don't want this one. When I say that it's good to know things, sometimes it's actually better not to know, because if they didn't know any of this, They would have still had birth with a child, and then maybe the child never would have even developed the disease. So they throw away an opportunity of having a child. So many people do. However, these less than 100 people are who've used this method of going for selecting a specific type of baby, that they only want a minority of people in this world. That they want disabled people not to exist at all, that we don't have the right to life, just because we suffer from something different altogether.
The technology has been on the market for 3 years, offered by just one company, Genomic Prediction.
For all of human history, birth has been sort of a lottery. What you have going on is chance, and sometimes fate is kind, and sometimes it's...
Another red flag right there. What you've got going on is chance. Now, that's from neo-Darwinism. That's from the Darwinian doctrines, which brought up the conclusions like females are physically and intellectually inferior compared to men, which led to the females' rights movement, the women's rights movement, because they went deeming women as intellectually and physically inferior. And that's from Darwinism, and it's according to Darwinism that it's done by chance. I'm going to quote someone called T.H. Morgan. He has to say, I quote, "The discovery that the same mutation happens over and over again, not only within the same species, but in different species, is, I think, one of the most interesting discoveries in recent genetic work. It means that certain kinds of changes in the germ material are more likely to occur than are others. The appearance of new variations in the hereditary material is something less of a random process than we had hitherto supposed." End of quote. So mutagenesis is not so random. If the mutations are not selected at some random rate, and we can see this in real life situations. Like at the moment, in areas where malaria is widespread and endemic, like Africa, we seem to see that the sickle-cell mutation is more dominant, but they choose to terminate fetuses with the sickle-cell mutation. But the sickle-cell mutation is a defense mechanism against malaria. It actually protects them from one disease, but makes them susceptible to another. So if we terminate the sickle-cell mutation altogether from the human gene pool, no one will be protected from malaria whatsoever, but malaria will continue spreading. So it's a bad idea to try and take over nature, as every time humans play God, we always go finding destructive consequences follow. So I thought we should have learned that by now.
It's cruel. What we're trying to do is to give people a better start.
But diseases aren't the only thing polygenic testing can screen for. Some parents are excited about using the technology to optimize their embryos for all kinds of things, like mental health or intellectual ability.
Octavian, the daffodils are over here. We have to go this way.
Simone and Malcolm Collins are entrepreneurs who believe that happiness itself is genetic.
Some people are just happier on average than other people. And if we can give our daughter a better shot in terms of her mood throughout her life, I don't know, I feel a moral imperative to do that.
Like the
Actually, no, it's very immoral to do that. There's a particular reason why he was sentenced for 3 years. The Chinese scientist who edited embryos, Lalan Lulu, he was sentenced for 3 years because of how dangerous it is and of just what kind of effects it can have, all this genetic selection of terminating specific genes from the human gene pool. And this is actually no different to what the Nazis were doing, no different to what the eugenicists were doing during the Eugenics movement. Like, it was Francis Galton's belief that everything about the human is genetic, that humans are genetically deterministic, that criminality, for example, that being a criminal is something you inherit from your parents. So he went accusing everyone that their parents are criminals. If the child became a criminal, then he assumed that their kids were going to become criminals. He assumed poverty was something else you inherit, but everything about the human. If you just allow me to turn to another on my right, I have a book called The Myth of Normal by Dr. Gabor. Because these people seem to think that humans are genetically deterministic. So if you just allow me to quote, these few paragraphs describe these people perfectly well, the ones who want to enhance things like IQ. I quote, "The dominant assumption in our culture is that genetic inheritance determines the better part of our destiny, who we are, what we suffer from, and what we are capable of. In 2000, at a White House briefing, Bill Clinton proclaimed the findings of the Human Genome Project, the most wondrous map ever produced by humankind, adding that, today we are learning the language in which God created life. The new science, the soon-to-be ex-president predicted, will revolutionize the diagnosis, prevention, and treatment of most, if not all, human disease, leading to cures for conditions like Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and cancer by attacking their genetic roots. 2 decades later, we know that little of the sort has happened, and for good reason. Genes are not, in fact, life's language, any more than a scrambled alphabet or a randomly arranged dictionary is a Shakespeare play, or a musical scale is equivalent to a John Coltrane solo. For letters or words to become language, they must be arranged, enunciated, inflected, punctuated with pauses, emphasized or softened. Like all building blocks, genes help make up the language of existence, but it is through the workings of epigenetics that they are activated, accented, or quieted. The mechanisms of epigenetics include, among myriad others, adding certain molecules to DNA sequences so as to change gene function, modifying the numbers of receptors for certain messenger chemicals, and influencing the interactions between genes. Experience, in other words, determines how genetic potential expresses itself in the end. This is what the field of epigenetics, meaning on top of genes, is all about. Epigenetic processes act on chromosomes, delivering and translating messages from the environment that tell the genes what to do. All this takes place without in any way altering the genes themselves. As the BBC's Martha Henriques explains, epigenetics offers a way of adapting to changing conditions without inflicting a more permanent shift in our genomes. It isn't that genes don't matter, they certainly do, only that they cannot dictate even the simplest behaviors, let alone account for most illnesses or address possible cures for them. Far from being the autonomous arbiters of our destinies, genes answer to their environment. Without environmental signals, they could not function. End of quote. So, just as I mentioned before, we are interconnected with the environment, our genes interacting with it, such as things like the climate that contributes towards your skin color. Your skin color is not 100% genetic. Your IQ, it's not 100% genetic, because if you don't do the reading, you don't do the maths, you're not going to get a very high IQ score. So all these people who want to enhance everything don't seem very knowledgeable about the topic and have the same beliefs as Francis Galton and the Nazis and the same goal as them.
The Cassidys, the Collins also used genomic prediction to analyze and rank their embryos' disease risk. Then they downloaded the raw data and paid a DNA analysis company called Self-Decode to get even more predictions, like whether the embryos could be adept at managing stress or suffer from brain fog or depression.
So I'm downloading both the PDF that they gave us. And hold on, I can stop this. Yeah, so what we got from genomic prediction was just a really simple report, which I actually quite like.
And so did you do IVF so that you could get data on your embryos?
Yeah, we already had all of our embryos that we needed to have 7 kids. We had 26 embryos good to go. but we did a whole new round just to be able to do this because it's so much additional information.
Interesting. So I see these embryos have health scores ranging from like negative 0.96 to like 1.9.
The Titan here, who turned out to be the one we selected, had the best score from our own internal, like additional data calculations and genomic predictions best.
Oh my gosh. Hey, Titan, you're number one. So wait, Titan, is that her name?
Titan Invictus.
What's that from?
Well, we want powerful names.
And we actually have a rule in the family against giving any of our daughters strictly female names because data shows that it has a lot of negative outcomes.
What would you like to test for that isn't currently available on the market?
IQ's the big one. Yeah. I think that's
educational.
I never get surprised when I see people bring up IQ. It's never surprising, and it only illustrates the stupidity and lack of knowledge of these people. So these who claim to have high IQ make very stupid choices, and that only shows that IQ does not equate to intelligence, that there's more to intelligence than just possessing knowledge. Those IQ tests are more like memory tests. You know, you just memorize the answers and then you just do the same thing the next time. You know, those IQ tests are not very difficult. If just turn back to another book again. If we go to PhD Thomas Armstrong's section, as these two would think autism's like a disease and so on. And since they wanted to raise IQ and give the kids the best intelligence, so they don't want an autistic kid, these two. So allow me to read a part from Thomas Armstrong's section about autism. I quote, "As we noted earlier, autistic individuals perform much better at tests that involve visual spatial tasks such as block design and embedded figures. There are even suggestions that when the interpersonal and language demands are removed from intelligence tests and the focus is on the reasoning based on pictures, IQ scores of autistic children increase from 30 to 70 percentile points compared with testing on the Welshire Intelligence Scale for Children. This is a research finding that could potentially lift many individuals diagnosed with autism out of the ranks of intellectually disabled. A recent study, in fact, suggests that autistics are actually 40% faster at the kind of problem solving done on the Ravens test compared with non-autistics. The lead researcher, Isabella Soler, notes, some critics argued that autistics would be unable to complete the RSPM because of its complexity. Yet, our study shows autistics complete it as efficiently and have a more highly developed perception than non-autistics." End of quote. So if autistic people have greater visual spatial skills, and if you've got to be autistic to have those skills at such a high level, how can you not have an autistic kid but still have the highest of and greatest of skills without being autistic? Now, say if I just turn back to Dr. Gabor Mate's book, The Myth of Normal, and go to a page called 250, you might have heard some disabled people with primarily genetic disabilities describe their disability as a gift, such as autism, like I just mentioned, because you find that a lot of what they're trying to avoid, like depression, that's actually what people with high IQ are more likely to experience. So they'll never get the way that they want. Right, I quote, "Don't be so sensitive," people are often told. In other words, don't be so yourself. Genetic vulnerabilities do not code for illness, but they may confer sensitivity for a person being more impacted by life's vicissitudes than someone else with a hardier predisposition. A far from trivial effect. Sensitive people feel deeply, and are more easily overwhelmed by stress, not just subjectively, but physiologically. Both monkeys and humans, for example, can inherit genes involved in the production of certain brain chemicals such as serotonin that can make them more susceptible to negative experiences, or on the other hand, more amenable to the effect of positive ones. Genes affect how sensitive one is to environment, and environment affects how relevant one's genetic differences may be, the leading geneticist R.C. Lewontin has said, when an environment changes, all bets are off. Some people will feel more pain and will therefore have greater need to escape into the adaptations that mental illness or addiction represent. They will have more need to tune out, to dissociate, to split into parts, to develop fantasies to account for realities they are unable to endure. But that's a far cry from saying that they have a heritable neurobiological disease. These are the children that Tom Boyce, a professor of pediatrics and psychiatry at the University of California, San Francisco, describes as orchids, exquisitely sensitive to their environment, making them especially vulnerable under conditions of adversity, but unusually vital, creative, and successful within supportive, nurturing environments. The same sensitivity genes that in a stressed environment can help potentiate mental suffering may, under positive circumstances, help promote stronger mental resilience and therefore happiness. Sensitive people have the potential to be more aware, insightful, inventive, artistic, and empathic if their sensitivity is not crushed by maltreatment or disdain. The most sensitive of our kind have made some of the most lasting cultural contributions. Many of these have also suffered the most intense pains during their lives. Sensitivity can be quintessential combo package, gift and curse, all in one. End of quote. So the gifts, the high IQ and so on, depression, anxiety, all of that comes in one package. The good and bad come together. You can't only get the good without having to pay the price. Such as I've got to pay the price for autism to get the positive aspects I see with autism. So no one will become immune to a disease.
Earning potential, like there are polygenic risk scores related to these.
Why do you think that it's not on the market? Polygenic risk scores for things like IQ or educational attainment.
Spicy.
It's very spicy.
It's spicy.
As soon as a company comes out and says, we allow you to select for height or intelligence or anything that's like, that seems evil or correlates with evil, then someone's going to come out and say they're a eugenicist, they're Nazi, whatever.
Because that's precisely what eugenicists were doing. That is exactly what eugenicists did. That was their exact goal. It was the exact same goal of the Nazis. So for these two to get so mad about it, that people just point the truth out that that's eugenics, it just shows that they both know they are guilty, that they do have the same attitudes as the Nazis and the eugenicists. This couple knows. And that's why they get so mad about it. Because they know that they are doing eugenics by only allowing certain people to come into the world.
And that really bothers us.
Whenever the state determines these are good genes, these are bad genes,
Or any coercive group.
Evil always results from that. But when you're talking about family level decisions, like me and my wife know we have some deadly disease and I want to make sure my kid doesn't get it.
Or I want my kid to have the highest IQ possible and good SAT scores.
Yes. Yeah. I don't think that either of those things are particularly morally questionable.
Oh, actually, they are very morally questionable. As we are talking about touching the germline here, the human germline. So if we take the Chinese scientist again and look at what he did, he removed CCR5 from the twins, and as a result, they became immune to HIV. But what else happened, you've got to ask yourself. By removing CCR5, they are now significantly more likely to be infected by West Nile disease. What he did was he's put them in greater health risks than what they were in to begin with. Going and altering genes and so on to avoid some diseases only makes them even more susceptible to alternative diseases. So you actually increase the risk, but then you're going to pass that on to the next generation. Because those two twins have not inherited any CCR5, they are both significantly susceptible to West Nile disease, And now when they have children, they'll pass that same thing on to their children. There's no CCR5 to be inherited, but their children will be significantly susceptible to West Nile disease altogether. And it's the same with the sickle-cell mutation. If you terminate that from the gene pool altogether, you affect future generations. So I would say this is very morally questionable. If you're going to go doing things to future generations, and this what we're talking about here, it will affect the entire human population. So I don't think this is a decision to be made by just the scientists or to be made by just by one couple like these two. But I think that the general public should be fully informed of all the pros, the potential benefits, all the cons, all the potential dangers that this can cause, such as something like a dystopian society where it works in favor of the rich but does not work for the poor, where things are so out of balance for those who are financially disadvantaged, and when they're thinking everything's genetically deterministic, that's one of the faults that we already know from the science. So the scientists should fully inform the public that we are not genetically deterministic, that IQ is not all down to genes, that skin color is not all down to genes, that they shouldn't do it for the sake of sex selection, saying that we should have more men in the world than women. That's more neo-Darwinism, which is debunked by scientists, proven wrong. So scientists should have to fully inform the public of all the pros, all the cons, and then it should be a decision among the human population, not a decision among a few people. Society should always be involved in such big decisions like this on should we ever touch the human germline, since that's going to affect our population as a whole. So if you just allow me again to turn back to one of the books. Here's a section where the author, Thomas Armstrong, calls it 3 cheers for the mutants. I quote, Evelyn Fox-Keller, Professor of History and Philosophy of Science at MIT, explains, we now know that mechanisms for enduring genetic stability are a product of evolution. Yet, a surprising number of mutations, in which at least some of these mechanisms are disabled, have been found in bacteria living under natural conditions. Why do these mutants persist? Is it possible that they provide some selective advantage to the population as a whole? Might the persistence of some mutated genes in a population enhance the adaptability of that population? Apparently so. New mathematical models of bacterial populations in variable environments confirm that, under such conditions, selection favors the fixation of some mutated alleles, and furthermore, that their presence accelerates the pace of evolution. Close quote. So if these mutations associated with disabilities enhance our adaptability, our likelihood to survive, wouldn't that mean terminating them from the human gene pool would reduce our likelihood to survive? As people say, removing one, it's not going to take us to extinction. Yeah, I agree there, but it'll take us one step closer to extinction. And each time we do it, we'll do it to one more. Then it gets easier each time, and it won't be long before we are stepping right there and are at the margins. So unless guidelines are put in place on not kicking all the mutations out of existence, we're talking about bringing extinction to our own species. Right, I continue. It was believed to be a mutation that caused large segments of the European population to survive the bubonic plague in the 14th century, and that continues to resist infections like HIV and smallpox in today's world. Mutations can also build on one another and create new metabolic pathways for the organism. As we've seen in Chapter 8, it may be mutations that created significant changes to the brain 100,000 years ago that led to new forms of thinking and culture. This suggests that we should always be on the lookout for aberrant behavior as possibly beneficial to the species. And as noted throughout this book, we have to counteract our natural tendency to see human nature with our current cultural myopia, since values change, and as they change, what we view as good in human functioning may turn out to be bad, and what we view as bad may turn out to be good. End of quote. So Thomas Armstrong's got a very strong case there, and if you would like to see some of the positives about disabilities to know the pros to them, I strongly recommend purchasing this book, The Power of Neurodiversity, and I'll write it in the description, all the books I've been quoting from. And I do recommend having a reading of that one especially, and Dr. Gabor Mate, The Myth of Normal, because more and more people now are becoming to see that normality by Francis Galton, Carl Pearson, and Ronald Fisher. But the whole concept of it, biostatistics, was made by 3 eugenicists altogether who were supportive of the Nazi Holocaust, who performed genocide. So I would recommend reading these books by these authors.
But to many people, polygenic testing is an ethical minefield. Part of the problem is that IVF is already prohibitively expensive. Rich patients optimizing their children's genes for success reminds people of a dystopian society, like the 90s sci-fi film Gattaca.
Genetics, what can it mean? The ability to perfect the physical and mental characteristics of every unborn child.
None of that's happening yet, but it's not because the science isn't there. It's because the only company on the market so far is only testing for diseases.
This is what we call high throughput SNP array technology.
High throughput SNP array technologies.
Yeah, so
that's hard to say.
Each well has this tiny microarray with probes that can detect the 800,000 positions in the genome within each embryo biopsy.
Nathan Treff is the scientific director of Genomic Prediction. The company is part of a multi-billion-dollar fertility industry boom, with investors chasing moonshots, like growing sperm and egg from stem cells in a lab and artificial wombs. But unlike those technologies, polygenic testing is here.
Think of a situation, right, when a patient comes in and they tell you that they have diabetes. I think it's unethical not to tell them that you can actually test your embryos for risk of diabetes. And I would be angry if I found out there was a test like that and that nobody told me about it.
Would genomic prediction ever go into testing for traits beyond diseases?
No.
I would say in that case, that's mainly the ethical guideline where I would write the guideline, is that genetic engineering should not go anywhere outside of medical matters. But then also when it comes to the concept of disease, I argue that we need to redefine what actually is a disease, what qualifies as a disease. For example, when we just look through the historical context of disorder as what it is today since Francis Galton made biostatistics, it was seen as a medical disorder to protest against slavery. But what the those was allowed today think about that? That was as recent as the 19th century, where actual physicians, scientists, respected scientists, when claimed that anyone who protests against slavery of black people has a medical disorder, then would have looked to those genes. So if we did it back in their day, but would have been lots of people who did not have a medical disorder who were going through all this genetic testing who would have been aborted. When we look back as recently as the 1950s, in 1952, the LGBTQ population was seen as pathological. What do we think about that today? So I would say that we actually need to re-establish a legitimate definition of what qualifies as a disease. Now, from the first book I quoted from, as I pointed out, I see health as more to do with relationships and so on. And then one of the other books I quoted from when I spoke about the environment, fixating certain mutations. So if we think about the sickle cell mutation again for a moment, where I said that's more dominant in regions where malaria is endemic, so we can see there's a relationship between the sickle cell mutation and the malaria. There's a relationship between them. We found that those who have one copy of the sickle cell mutation tend to be protected from malaria and are not destined to develop sickle cell anemia. So that seems like a very healthy option. But those who have no copies of the sickle cell mutation are far more susceptible to malaria infections, but are not destined to sickle cell anemia. But those who have two copies of the gene of the sickle cell mutation, but they're far more likely to get sickle cell disease, sickle cell anemia. So I would say it would be ethical to use genetic engineering to move us to put humans towards having just one copy of hemoglobin and one of the sickle cell mutation. That way they won't become so susceptible to malaria infections and will be cured of sickle cell disease. And we've got disabled people themselves who say they don't want to be cured. So why shouldn't we allow them human autonomy? And that's actually part against the present bioethics code is that they're not allowed to do anything to invade someone's autonomy. So if you view embryos as living organisms, as actual humans still, while they're still in that state of an embryo, you're actually violating that embryo's human rights. So I actually say that we need to redefine what is a disease and which ones are actually eligible to genetic engineering before we go any further forward.
At one point, Genomic Prediction advertised polygenic testing for intellectual disability, and you've since stopped marketing that. Why is that?
I think the main reason is that it really distracted from the healthcare benefits of the testing. And the majority of patients want to reduce disease risks.
Where is the line between disease and trait? It doesn't seem as simple or as black and white.
No, I think it's an important question. And we can all have our own opinions, right? It's not really society's place to tell individuals whether they should do something one way or another when it comes to having children.
Where do you think this technology is going?
Actually, yes, it should be up to society with this kind of genetic engineering because, as you already mentioned, it's going to affect the entire human population. It's not just going to affect the specific individual by touching the human germline. It's then going to affect our ecosystem. It could result in ecological disasters. It could result in totalitarianism, people taking total authority over the lives of others. That's why it's already mentioned in this video about how it will cause a big division between the wealthy and the poor, and so on. And I've seen some people make the argument saying, "Oh, but we used to say the same thing about computers and phones. We thought poor people would never have access to phones." But just to debunk that argument, it still goes on today, is that we've got the wealthiest, they're the ones who have access to the advancements. So as this technology advances, the wealthy will remain access to it, but it will still be at a very higher price for the advanced parts, that the poor won't be able to afford it, and the poor just have to live with the leftovers. Like, that's what those phones as tiny as that today, that just go there, or that flip open. Those phones are just like leftovers. It's just like garbage today. Most people just chuck it in the bin. You can get it for about £5 or something. $5, those kinds of phones now. But all those who are not so poor, who are not financially disadvantaged, they can get access to phones which are like $700, up to an entire grand, £1,000, $1,000, phones as expensive as that, with all the advancements, all the new technology, while the poor have no access to the new. And as this genetic testing advances, the poor won't have access to the advancements, they'll only have access to what's left behind. So the division will always stay there. There'll always be that big gap between the rich and the poor, which I would say is unethical to disallow access to the poor. Such as when we look in deprived areas in society, areas which are full of the poor, we found that health problems tend to be more dominant in those regions because those individuals cannot afford to pay for the medical help they need. By not being able to afford to, their health issues only get worse and worse and worse until eventually the health system has no choice but to bring them in. Yes, they developed a disease, or something, say, for those on the poor because they didn't have access to this technology. But that disease could have been prevented if they were given access, just like the wealthy. So whether you get cured, your health is going to be determined by wealth. It's going to be determined by how much money have you got, which I would say is very unfair and very unjust. It's a health injustice, not just a social injustice.
Well, it's only going to get better in the future. It'll seem silly that we didn't use this when there's an opportunity to do it.
Right now,
it will seem silly that we didn't do this when we had the opportunity to do it. As I mentioned about seeing protesting against slavery as a medical disorder, well, if we did it back then to those people, what would we be thinking? What are we thinking about claiming, oh, women are physically and intellectually inferior compared to men? And then we would have done this kind of stuff to women, to all the women. The LGBTQ, what do we think about the Nazi Holocaust? All of these things were done by genuine, respected scientists. So just because this man's a respected scientist, that doesn't make him any less susceptible to all the societal biases, towards the social bias going on, that causes all the social injustices among our communities. So he's not going to see it as stupid because of his own bias. Like, I don't see it as stupid to accept disabilities and allow it to be up to the individual. I don't see that as stupid because, well, that's my bias, isn't it? So they've all got the biases still, and then with them being the scientists, they're the ones who direct the research. They're the ones who get to direct which direction we are going to go in. So it's a matter of asking what changes do we want in society, but then they'll ask the kind of questions that will lead us towards what it is that we want in our society. Like whether wanting to cure so many diseases, for example, they've been asking ableist questions that take them in the direction to getting what they want in order to bring that, in order to make that happen. Such as looking for cures for autism, cures for ADHD, and so on. When these things are not fatal at all, Down syndrome's not fatal, but they already go doing it, even though there's false positives, already performing genocide on babies with Down syndrome. So we know that they're no different to what the Nazis were doing. We've got the exact same goal, that we're going to use the social prejudice, and that's basically what this is. It's just a reflection of cultural prejudice.
Right now in the US, there aren't specific regulations on polygenic testing. So how far the technology goes depends completely on the private market. And that worries bioethicist Laura Hersher.
I don't object to what genomic prediction does, like across the board, what they're offering now. I also think that it's quite possible that this very limited menu of things is sort of a starter place. And if they see greater acceptance and comfort level, that we're going to very quickly get to a place where we may be much more uncomfortable.
like what?
There is sort of a nervousness around turning reproduction into this highly commercial enterprise where people are looking to get their hands on a certain type of child. And is that going to create a situation where people are less accepting?
That's exactly what the Nazi Holocaust was. They were doing precisely the same thing. That's exactly what they were doing. So we know that we are on the path to another Nazi Holocaust zone. We are in that path if we don't debunk it soon and get it out of his minds.
accepting of, who and what they get.
Do you think we've reached the line? Like we're at the point where this testing has already gone too far?
One thing you learn when you're in this field is the future comes very fast. And once something is entrenched, it's very hard to either get rid of it or change expectations or alter people's thoughts about what is and isn't appropriate. So the time to discuss it is right now.
The time to discuss it is right now. I actually emailed the Human Genome Research and so on individually, one-to-one with them, their whole organization, asking them questions like, the girl claimed that they're trying to get rid of the eugenics. I then asked them questions like, well, why do you approve of aborting babies just because they'll be born with Down syndrome according to your prediction? I asked them, why is the clinical websites all over claiming they're going to do it to ADHDers? Why is the clinical websites over all over claiming they're aiming to do it to autistics? Yep, autism, ADHD, Down syndrome are not fatal, and they all come with positives, pros, as well as cons. Everyone's got both difficulties and strengths. So why must our difficulties be seen as so-called deficits, but not yours, those of you who are not seen as disabled? So you see that it already is at a selection of who they want to exist and who they don't want to, that they're trying to manipulate and produce the perfect human race, that the Human Genome Project is already doing precisely that, exactly what the Nazis were doing. So whenever someone is seen as socially insignificant, they are going to give that a label, they are going to label it some kind of disorder, then they're just going to try and wipe that class of people out of the midst of our human population, and then that'll just be another mutation out of the human gene pool that nature wanted to sustain, whether it was through pressure or positive selection. And that's one step closer to premature extinction. We then select another, so that's more mutations kicked out the gene pool, then that's it, we lose more, we are one step closer to extinction. And each time social norms change, what was seen as socially valuable in the past may be devalued in the future, and they'll regret kicking it out of the gene pool, especially since we maybe possibly needed it. So if I just turn back and quote a psychologist from one of the books again. Right, I quote, speaking of dyslexia, psychologist Howard Gardner warns, with the coming of age of genetics, the danger magnifies. Beyond doubt, we will discover genes that are important for reading alphabetical scripts, and there is already evidence that a small set of genes may be related to reading problems. As with the brain evidence, such information can be helpful for early intervention, but it could easily be used for stigmatizing purposes. Indeed, it might become relevant for marriage prospects, holding a job, securing insurance, or even eugenic purposes. And no doubt, especially in our interventionist society, individuals with a genetic predisposition for reading problems will look into various kinds of genetic engineering or therapy. It is possible that such interventions will work and have no negative side effects, but it is perhaps more likely that they will have unanticipated effects. And we might even want to consider which valued human abilities, examples, spatial or pattern recognition skills, might be placed at risk were we to target our interventions specifically at reading disorders. Similarly, when we review the abilities of the neurodiverse individuals highlighted in the course of this book, we might imagine how humanity would be impoverished without them. Speaking of his sister with Down syndrome, Brian Scott Kerr, a physician at Children's Hospital in Boston, writes, every day my sister teaches me lots of life lessons, to laugh when others are mocking me, to keep on trying when obstacles are thrown my way. If there were a world with fewer people with Down syndrome, I think the world would miss all these important lessons. A neurodiverse world is a rich world, Let's do all we can to preserve those aberrant genes and keep our civilization vital, diverse, and interesting. End of quote. As I said, I strongly recommend this book to anyone who's interested. I'll just tell you who PhD Thomas Armstrong is by reading the blurb. Right. Thomas Armstrong, PhD, is an award-winning author and speaker who has written 14 books, including 7 Kinds of Smart and Multiple Intelligences in the Classroom. Dr. Armstrong has also written for many periodicals, including Parenting, Ladies' Home Journal, and Family Circle, and has appeared on Today, CNN, and the BBC. He lives in Northern California. And the blurb says, neurodiversity, a new term that changes the way we think about neurological disorders. Neurodiversity, the right word at the right time to account for recent evidence from brain science, evolutionary psychology, and other fields suggesting that we pay close attention to the bright spots of promise and possibility appearing in people who are differently wired. Celebrated educator and psychologist Thomas Armstrong offers a revolutionary, inspiring guide illuminating critical information such as what recent research says about the specific strengths found in people with dyslexia, ADHD, autism, and other mental health diagnoses, how to construct the ideal environmental niche for a neurodiverse person, how to take advantage of assistive technologies and what's to come in the future, which career paths emphasize the gifts of neurodiverse adults, why inclusive classrooms offer the best learning experience for neurodiverse children, a passionate, compassionate, and practical look at the myriad strengths of anyone who is differently abled. The power of neurodiversity is essential reading for parents, educators, mental health professionals, and anyone intrigued by how our brains work and what secrets they hold. A major work revolutionary and humane, drawing on the latest scientific evidence, Dr. Armstrong argues convincingly that the disease-based model needs to be replaced by an understanding of brain differences that characterize neuropsychological conditions. This book could not be more timely. And Temple Grandin, the author of Thinking in Pictures, writes on the back, parents, teachers, and policymakers should all read this thought-provoking book. I loved it. End of quote. So yes, I do strongly recommend Thomas Armstrong's book there. If you would like to see the strengths of disabled people and of what people are thinking about throwing away, all the skills and abilities. Like if you're a neurodivergent yourself, you'll come to find a big list of possible careers that you might, or if you've got a neurodivergent child, you can find in this book a big list of careers that may be good for your disabled child, which your child may thrive in those areas. So you'll know what areas to look for in your children to help increase their quality of life and help them be successful.
He's up.
You're sleeping hard now, bud.
The Cassidys had their baby in April.
Do you think about the social implications of this testing?
I think it's like a hammer. You can build a house with a hammer or you can attack somebody with a hammer. But
we see the positive in it right now, that it's going to allow us to have our family.
I mean, our society is arguing about the price of insulin. And what if we could just eliminate diabetes?
I don't quite know any of the pros to diabetes, as I haven't come across any of that, and any positive for diabetes yet. But basically, you're saying, let's kick out of the human gene pool all disabilities, all disorders, all so-called diseases, etc. So the things which I've just quoted from is suggesting we kick out of the gene pool so many things that contribute to human abilities, where Dr. Gabor pointed out that it's like a gift and a curse in one package. These lot are talking about throwing away a lot of gifts. If you think of the 3 primary colours and mixing them all together, of how many different shadings you'll get. If you remove the blue from it, just remove one, as little as one bit from it, and you're going to lose all the purple shadings, all the blue shadings, and all the green shadings. You'll lose all the brown because you wouldn't have been able to make a third colour out of the secondary colours. So you lose so much by removing just one piece of DNA. Just by removing one, it can do so much damage. It's not as simplistic as people seem to think it is.
That's the good thing come from all of it. Life is really hard for everyone. And if you can make it a little bit easier to not have health problems, then we should try to help as many people with that as we can.
Well, that's the end of that video. So I would say that since we actually had an illustration right there that there's organisations that were testing for intellectual disability to kick them out the midst of our population, that we've already got genocide occurring among those to be born with Down syndrome, since that's already occurring, I would say that since we've got people wanting to enhance things like IQ and so on, they obviously are not educated about it. So I would say that the scientists behind it, if we actually want to put this technology to use to its full potential, to the good that it can do, we actually need scientists to inform the general public, make the general public fully informed of all the pros and the cons so that we can balance out, how far should we go? Are we going to play God again and cause destructive consequences? So ethics and so on here really do come into place, especially with the socio-economic values, the things Thomas Armstrong mentions, things like what's seen as socially positive today may be socially negative in the future, but you terminated that. Or Howard Gardner pointed out, by doing this, we're going to put so many abilities at risk. As Dr. Gabor Mate points out, that so many gifts will be placed at risk if you are not willing to face things like anxiety. We've got Dr. Francis Allen, he's got a YouTube channel of his own where I think his channel is called Medicating Normal, where apparently he's trying to save normal as he complains about the DSM system, of how the DSM-5, because of it, people get misdiagnosed, they get drugged all the time just to make money for Big Pharma. So many psychiatrists who actually take the field seriously say that today psychiatry is just a marketing plot. It's all about making money, selling disorders so they can sell drugs, selling disorders so they can sell interventions like ABA. If just allow me to turn to one of the books on my side. This one, The Autism Industrial Complex by Alicia A. Broderick. If I just quote from the beginning, someone called Elizabeth B. Torres, PhD, professor and computational neuroscientist of the Rutgers University, principal investigator, director of the New Jersey Autism Center of Excellence. She writes at the beginning of Professor Alicia Broderick's book that she read in advance, I quote, "Autism is at an inflection point today. We are poised for a paradigm shift in autism research, education, and therapies. This book initiates that shift and does so superbly. In the autism industrial complex, how branding, marketing, and capital investment turned autism into big business. We'll learn about the history and evolution of this multi-billion-dollar per year operation. Thanks to this history, we'll remember Lovaas, ABA, and behaviorism in general, not as a science, but as a branding, rhetoric, and marketing plot that transiently misguided many well-intended parents and professionals, and by in so doing profited with greed by preying on our human hopes, our trust in science, and our fears." End of quote. So you find ABA using autism just to make itself money. It's just a business, applied behavior analysis. And where I spoke about the social implications, you find another book here which I've read through. If I just read you the opening page, it says, I quote, building on work in feminist studies, queer studies, and critical race theory, this volume challenges the universality of propositions about human nature by questioning the boundaries between predominant neurotypes and others, including dyslexics, autistics, and ADHDers. This is the work of its kind to bring cutting-edge research across disciplines to the concept of neurodiversity. It offers in-depth explorations of the themes of cure, prevention, eugenics, neurodivergent well-being, cross-neurotype communication, neurodiversity at work, and challenging brain-bound cognition. It analyzes the role of neuronormativity in theorizing agency and the proposal for a new alliance between the Hearing Voices movement and neurodiversity. In doing so, we contribute to a cultural imperative to redefine what it means to be human. To this end, we propose a new field of inquiry that finds ways to support the inclusion of neurodivergent perspectives in knowledge production, and which questions the theoretical and mythological assumptions that produce the idea of the neurotypical. Working at the crossroads between sociology, critical psychology, medical humanities, critical disability studies, and critical autism studies, and sharing theoretical ground with critical race studies and critical queer studies, the proposed new field, neurodiversity studies, will be of interest to people working in all these areas. End of quote. So even in that book, more and more people, like the book I just quoted from, described normal as mythological. Dr. Alan Francis describing normal as mythological. Dr. Gabor Mate, right here, the author of this book, describing normal as mythological, the myth of normal. The book about evolution, which I quoted from, mutations, not just a random process. PhD Thomas Armstrong, The Power of Neurodiversity, pointing out that normativity is just mythological. So found that altogether, this is the work of Francis Galton, Those After the So-Called Normal Average Human, by Adolf Quatler, Francis Galton, Carl Pearson, and Ronald Fisher, Three Racist Snobs, and the French statistician Adolf Quatler. And all of this thinking statistics are objective, but they're not as objective as people seem to think they are. So, if you've made it this far, thank you for listening. Please share with me your thoughts about the ethical guidelines, about where do you think the line should be drawn? How should we use this technology? And which so-called disorders do you think we should actually eliminate? And how would you define a disorder altogether? How would you qualify one? Because I'm sure you don't qualify protesting against slavery as a medical disorder. So we see that all throughout ages, it's all been based on social norms, but we're finding now so many protesting against normativity. So what's the future paradigm going to be concerning disease? So how would you describe what a disease is? Please share your thoughts in the description below, and if you would, please subscribe and help spread the message and share both the pros and the cons of genetic engineering and human germline editing. If you made it this far, thank you for listening.